of politics, ensuring that our politicians reflect contemporary Britain to gain the extra votes needed to get over the line.
Analysis was presented by Rosie Campbell. The producer was Vicky Broadbent.
This is who we are. Lioness, My Journey to Glory by Beth Mead.
Scoring that many goals in front of that many fans screaming my name was the biggest rush of blood I'll ever get in my career.
Welcome to the neighbourhood with Jade Adams.
Is the seagull strong enough to break windows? Someone called Porry's now replied, does it have a hammer?
And the Music and Meditation Podcast.
We're going to explore topics like how to deal with imposter syndrome to help us feel calm and step into life with a new energy.
Celebrating who we are. Listen on BBC Sounds.
Westminster Hour is coming up shortly. First, let's take a look at the weather. Tonight, much of the UK will be mild but unsettled, with cloudy skies and rain for much of the time. Across the far north of Scotland, the rain will turn increasingly to snow. Later, England, Wales and Northern Ireland should see some clear spells, but with heavy and locally thundery showers around. It'll be increasingly windy for many. Tomorrow will be very windy for some, with southern Britain and northern Scotland seeing gales. Much of the UK will see further rain or showers, some heavy and locally thundery, although the far south should have some sunshine. In northern Scotland, there will be some further snow, extending to high ground in southern Scotland later. This is BBC Radio 4.
It's 10 o'clock. Welcome to 60 minutes of news and conversation with me, Nick Watt, and my guests. This is the Westminster Hour. The main news tonight, there are signs that the BBC is close to resolving a dispute with Gary Lineker, which has prompted other presenters to boycott the corporation's sports output. An offer has been made for the UK arm of Silicon Valley Bank after its collapse in America, putting customer deposits at risk. And the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has played down the prospect of big tax cuts in the budget on Wednesday. Coming up, we'll be looking ahead to the Chancellor's statement with the Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, Labour frontbencher Helen Hayes and the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, Torsten Bell. We'll also consider the row over Gary Lineker's tweets. Natasha Clark will be our expert guide to the week at Westminster, including MPs' first chance to vote on the government's new legislation to tackle small boats. And we'll be talking defence and foreign policy too, with the AUKUS summit getting underway in California. That's all coming up after the news, read for us by Andrew Crawford.
BBC News understands that talks to resolve the row between Gary Lineker and the corporation are moving in the right direction, but some issues haven't been resolved. Match of the Day 2, which is on air shortly, will be cut to just 15 minutes. Schedules have been disrupted throughout the day after some BBC sports presenters and pundits again refused to show up for work in protest at Mr Lineker's suspension. He'd been ordered off-air because he tweeted criticism of the government's policy on migrants and compared its language to that of Nazi Germany. But the Match of the Day presenter has the backing of his former England teammate, John Barnes.
I support Gary not because he's my friend, because I believe he's right in what he says. The language used is similar to the language used in Germany in 1930. The outcome is not going to be the same. We're not suggesting, or he's not suggesting, that it's like Nazi Germany, but the language used in dehumanizing a certain group of people is the exact same language.
Rishi Sunak said that 45,000 people had illegally crossed the Channel last year, and this was the real substantive issue. He defended the government's policy of banning migrants who arrived in small boats from ever claiming asylum, saying that the proposals represented a compassionate and effective response. Mr Sunak also described Gary Lineker as a very talented presenter and said he hoped the BBC could resolve the row in a timely fashion. The dispute has divided these football fans outside Old Trafford.
That might be Gary Lineker's beliefs, but I don't think he should have aired them. I just think someone in that position I don't think they should be speaking out.
But I never think of Gary Lineker and BBC together. I think of Gary Lineker separate from the BBC's freelance. He should be able to say what he wants.
Our media correspondent, David Silito, has been following the latest developments.
The standoff between the BBC and Gary Lineker over his political tweets that has seen him taken off air, and a weekend of disruption as fellow presenters, pundits and commentators downed microphones in solidarity, looks to be coming to a conclusion. It's understood talks are moving in the right direction. There are hopes of a resolution in the next day or so. But the fine detail of resolving issues about those tweets is still under discussion. With programmes being dropped from schedules or radically truncated, there is a certain urgency to finding an escape route out of this. But they're not quite there yet.
There's been a potential breakthrough tonight in efforts to rescue the UK arm of Silicon Valley Bank, one of the main lenders to tech startups. The Bank of London has made an offer to buy SVB, which is facing insolvency after its American parent firm collapsed. Companies had warned they were facing imminent cash flow problems without intervention. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, insisted he would do everything possible to stop SVB's customers running out of money. But Labour said he needed to offer more than warm words. Our business correspondent, Mark Ashdown, has the latest.
It styles itself on the cool bank for cool clients. 3,500 UK start-up technology companies bank with SVB UK. But it's heading for insolvency, with £7 billion worth of their money tied up. It has raised serious questions about how some might pay their staff and suppliers in the coming days, potentially putting thousands of jobs at risk. Startups often run at a loss for years and survive with very little day-to-day cash flow. After a group of 200 CEOs wrote to the Prime Minister and Chancellor overnight calling for urgent government intervention, Jeremy Hunt told Laura Koonsberg on BBC One that he wanted to avoid or at least minimise any losses to them.
What we will do is bring forward very quickly a plan to make sure that they can meet their operational cash flow requirements.
Will that plan mean 100% guarantee of their deposits?
But you'll have to wait to see the whole plan.
The Chancellor also sought to reassure the wider banking industry that there was no systemic threat, but business leaders warned that the UK technology sector could be facing an existential one, as SVB UK was a unique bank in terms of funding startups. Amy Lewin is the editor of Sifted, which reports on the technology industry.
Most tech startups, it is harder for them to bank with traditional banks. Lots of banks don't understand their needs in the same way as Silicon Valley Bank did. It really was a specialist. So a lot of them had a lot of money in just Silicon Valley Bank and they couldn't transfer it out fast enough.
Tonight it emerged that a consortium of private equity firms led by the Bank of London had submitted a bid for Silicon Valley Bank UK. The bid will be assessed by the Treasury, the Bank of England and regulators.
The Prime Minister has warned that China presents what he calls an epoch-defining challenge to the global order. Rishi Sunak made the comments on his way to California, where he's due to meet his Australian counterparts, Anthony Albanese, and President Biden. Britain, Australia and the United States make up the so-called AUKUS Defence Pact, aimed at improving security in the Indo-Pacific region around China. Our political editor Chris Mason is travelling with Mr Sunak and has just sent this report from his flight to San Diego.
War rages in Europe, in Ukraine, and simultaneously senior government figures worry that so much of what they observe in China is a cause for increasing concern too. Rishi Sunak told me the regime in Beijing, as he put it, was increasingly authoritarian at home and assertive abroad. That might sound like strong language, but some of his MPs would like it to be stronger. It does appear more robust than what he said before Christmas, but he no longer describes the country as a threat, as he did when he was campaigning to be Prime Minister last summer. Beyond words, there will be actions at this summit of three leaders, with promises to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. At the same time, back home tomorrow, the government will publish what it will call its Integrated Review Refresh, its outlook on global security and defence, and what it's going to do about it.
Jeremy Hunt has played down the prospect of major tax cuts in the budget on Wednesday, saying he must act responsibly. The Chancellor has faced pressure from senior Conservatives to announce cuts. Labour says more investment in green technology is needed. Our political correspondent Jonathan Blake reports.
For his first budget as Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt is keeping expectations firmly in check. He said he wants to introduce measures to encourage some of the many thousands of people who've left the workforce since the pandemic back into employment. But some senior Conservatives are urging the Chancellor to lower the tax burden by, for example, pausing the planned rise in corporation tax. Mr. Hunt stressed the need for responsibility.
It's very important that we remember that businesses need stability, and that means they need to know that we are being careful with the public finances. We're not going to run out of money.
Plans already announced include the government paying childcare support to parents on universal credit up front instead of in arrears, as is the case now, and a rise in the cap per child that can be claimed. There'll be changes to sickness benefits and an extension to support for energy bills. Labour argue more investment is needed in new industries. The Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves said the Conservatives had sent the UK into a low-growth spiral.
We're going to be importing electric vehicles, importing steel, we're going to be importing hydrogen and electricity because we failed at this moment to seize those opportunities.
Jeremy Hunt has promised hope for the future, and a slightly improved economic picture could give him some scope to ease the strain on household finances. But any big tax cuts are far more likely in next year's budget, closer to a general election.
Israeli forces have shot dead 3 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. There's been a surge in violence in the region in recent months. From Jerusalem, here's our Middle East correspondent, Tom Bateman.
The 3 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces at a junction in a town adjacent to a Jewish settlement. The Israeli military says gunmen had shot at an army outpost and its forces returned fire. Pictures show a car possibly used by the Palestinians after apparently being searched. The army says it seized M16 rifles and arrested a 4th militant. Deadly violence is continuing to mount. 9 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces in raids in the space of 3 days last week, while a Hamas gunman targeted Israelis in central Tel Aviv on Thursday, wounding 3, one of them critically.
This year's Oscars ceremony gets underway in Los Angeles in 2 hours' time. The sci-fi adventure Everything, Everywhere, All at Once is favourite to win Best Picture, while the British stars Bill Nighy and Andrea Riseborough are up for acting prizes.
Thank you, Andrew. You're listening to the Westminster Hour with me, Nick Watt. Let's meet my panel, all gathered here in the studio with me. Catherine Fletcher is the Conservative MP for South Ribble. She won the seat at the 2019 election. Catherine was briefly a minister under Liz Truss, but really made her name at the COP26 Climate Summit, where she was aide to the UK President Alok Sharma. And yes, Catherine, you did answer all my questions in Glasgow. Catherine has now returned to the backbenches and sits on the Science and Technology Select Committee. Helen Hayes represents Dulwich and West Norwood for Labour, and she's also the Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years. Helen's a former town planner who ran her own company. Torsten Bell runs the Resolution Foundation, the think tank specialising in the living standards of low to middle income households. He knows his way around the Treasury too. He was advisor at the side of the former Chancellor Alistair Darling throughout the banking and financial crisis under the last Labour government. And finally, Natasha Clark is with us too. She is the chief political correspondent at The Sun. That's the title I used to have at The Guardian, rather different paper. So very, very, very important title. Anyway, welcome to all of you. I'm going to start with you, Torsten, and that is because we have another banking crisis after the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. Now, on the flight, it looks like, to San Diego, the AUKUS summit there, Rishi Sunak said he doesn't believe there's what he called a systemic contagion risk. In other words, there's no danger to other financial institutions, but it does look like they will be burning the midnight oil in your old place of work, the Treasury, tonight, because of big concerns that hundreds of UK tech firms which use this bank could go under. Torsten, how big are the stakes here?
Well, I mean, it's not great having a flashback to banks going bust. Most of us who didn't need to work into the Treasury to be traumatised by what happened a decade and a half ago. So I think people will understandably be worried. What's happening here is obviously different. You've got a specific problem about an American bank that has basically taken out way too much risk on interest rates, and interest rates have then gone up and the bank has taken a kicking, and investors and depositors have therefore looked at it and said, we don't fancy that, which is why the US bank is insolvent. The UK bank has then followed that, but it's a lot smaller. The Chancellor and the and the governor of the Bank of England have both said it's not systemic. So this isn't like RBS going bust. This bank's only got about 3,000 clients, but for those companies, and this is mainly about corporate clients, it's obviously very concerning because they want to pay their wages, and once a bank is insolvent, all of the deposits there, up to £85,000 per company, will be frozen, so people won't have access to their cash. And if you look at what the government's doing today, there's two things going on. They are trying to find a buyer for the bank. That is what you always do when a bank gets into trouble. The easiest way to deal with this without the state having to get very involved is to find somebody else to buy the bank. So that is what's going on. There seem to be quite a few people interested in doing so. That is the cleanest way to make the UK bit of this problem go away. But then alongside that, the government is also working up plans to basically provide cash flow and liquidity support. So not underwriting those deposits people have in the bank that are frozen, but saying